Welcome, friends. Hag Sameach. So this is our main Tikkun Leil. So something like a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Uh, One of the things we'll talk about in our session today is the tradition of Tikkun Leil, staying up all night learning Torah. I am already too old for that. I've done it before, and it's great fun, but man, it messes up my internal clock really badly, and I have stuff to do. So I won't be staying up all night learning with you, but I will be doing a little extra teaching and a little extra learning this evening for the sake of the Hag. So I have kind of two different sessions for you. We're going to start with a survey of Shavuot traditions and their origins. The question I posed, or the sort of description I posed in the email that went out, was what do we do on Shavuot anyway? Even though Shavuot ritual practices might be a little less recognizable than things like Hanukkah or Pesach or other holidays that are much more well known, there are actually still a number of rich traditions. And as part of wrap up, we'll maybe talk a little bit about why we think it's not quite as developed or quite as conspicuous as some of those other holidays. And then after a short break, we'll come back, and I know a lot of folks are planning to come to the more psychedelic of the two shiurim tonight, which is focusing on a particular verse from the book of Exodus that, well, you'll be surprised. I'm calling it Seeing Sound Synesthesia at Sinai, which is both alliterative and difficult to pronounce, and I think you'll really enjoy that one as well. So as we go through, by all means, please speak up and ask questions. You can just go ahead and take yourself off of mute. To do that, you can also ask questions in the chat. I should be able to see those as well. I think we'll be able to get through most of this, but if we dwell longer on some points and go more quickly over others, that'll be okay. That'll be okay. But definitely we'll wrap up by about 8:25 so that we can all have a little bit of a break, go get a bite of cheesecake or whatever it is we need, and come back for our second shiur. Sounds good? All right. So I'll give a little introduction first. So Shavuot literally means weeks, like the week of like 7 days, right? And it takes place, what we know already, from our sort of modern approach to Shavuot. It takes place 7 weeks after Passover. Either on the 6th or on the 6th to 7th of the Hebrew month of Sivan. And if you've heard explanations of what Shavuot is all about, you may have heard kind of a dual nature to it. It's, on the one hand, an agricultural festival. It's a holiday that celebrates the summer grain harvest that took place in the land of Israel. And it also has associations with celebrating the day the Jewish people received the Torah. So this doesn't represent actually some kind of confusion or as the meaning of Shavuot or competing interpretations even necessarily. These are actually both authentic answers to the question of what is Shavuot about. Compare a somewhat more familiar example. Hanukkah, for example. Is Hanukkah about the Maccabees' victory over Antiochus? Yes, right? Is it about the miracle of the oil? Also, yes. It's also, I hear lots of interpretations about how Hanukkah is about, light in the darkness of the wintertime. That is also an authentic meaning to Hanukkah. So like many Jewish holidays, Hanukkah and Shavuot, they have particular roots, have they some more kind of original meaning to them. But over the thousands of years that Jews have celebrated them, Jews have reinterpreted those meanings, even as they've held on to and celebrated those roots. So our survey of Shavuot traditions tonight will cover the biblical sources of Shavuot, some sources pertaining to Shavuot as the day that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. We'll talk about Shavuot, the cheesecake holiday. One of the traditions is to eat dairy foods. We'll talk about the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, staying up all night studying Torah. We'll talk about a slightly lesser known, perhaps, decorating with green plants and things, especially in synagogues and prayer spaces. And we'll talk a little bit, as long as we have time, about reading the book of Ruth. One of the 5 scrolls, one of the Chamesh Megillot, is another tradition to read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. Okay. Questions before we dive in further? Let me call up our sources. Here we go. Get my windows arranged so I can see as many people as possible and see if you come off of mute. Okay. And the chat box. Okay. So I stole some pictures to use on the source sheet this time. They're all from the National Library of Israel. So I won't dwell on them too long because those aren't the, exactly the what I'm here to talk about. And obviously this is not a photographic representation of bringing the first fruits to Jerusalem. This is an artist's conception from 1730 of what it would have been like to bring bikurim to Jerusalem. If you don't know what bikurim are, well, let's talk about that. Okay. So our first mention of something, well, I'm not even going to say Shavuot yet. And I realized I forgot to number these sources, so I'll have to call them by their names. Could I get a volunteer to read that first source from Exodus 23? Someone to just read it out loud for us. Just go ahead and take yourself off of mute. Who's got it? Richard, please.
3 times a year you shall hold a festival for me. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days as I have commanded you, at the set time in the month of Aviv. For in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. And the feast of the harvest of the first fruits of your work, of what you sow in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in the results of your work from the field.
All right, thank you, Richard. So the Torah here identifies those what we call today the shalosh regalim. Those are the first words used there in the Hebrew. Shalosh, 3 regalim. So regel is a reish gimel lamed, has 2 meanings. Regel is a regular time or a regular occasion, and it's also a foot or a leg. And those are related here because the idea for each of these is that there were regular occasions on which you would make a pilgrimage by foot to Jerusalem to make offerings at the temple there. Okay, so I highlighted the 3 festivals it talks about. Who can name them by their, who has an idea of what 3 festivals these are referring to? Give their sort of more familiar names.
Passover.
Good. Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover. Good.
Shavuot.
And?
Sukkot.
Very good. Thank you, Leah. Okay. So none of those are called by that name here, interestingly. These are evidently earlier, unfamiliar names. Shavuot, the middle of the two, what it calls here the Feast of the Harvest, Chag HaKatzir, is identified here with the summer grain harvest, right? It says you'll bring the first fruits of your work. It says bikurei ma'asecha. So bikurim, and bikurim means we need 2 words in English to say what 1 word in Hebrew can say. It's your first fruits. It's like the very first things that you harvest of any given type of food. The first fruits of your work of what you sow in the field, right? So note, there's a set time for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? What we would call today Pesach, right? You shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, as I've commanded you, at the set time in the month of Aviv. Note also, there is no month of Aviv on the Hebrew calendar currently. Evidently, at the stage when this text was written, the calendar months had different names. The months that we have, the prevailing idea today is the months we have today reflect a Babylonian influence, which scholars seem to think we picked up while the Jews were in exile in Babylonia. So today we would say that Pesach happens in the month of Nisan, but here it says the month of Aviv. For in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. What about those other 2? Any idea when those are supposed to take place? Any sort of set time? Not really, huh? Feast of the Harvest should take place, I guess, when you do the harvesting. And similarly, the Feast of Ingathering is at the end of the year, I guess, whenever you're done harvesting, right? You gather in the results of your work. So note here, we can sort of tell that this is referring to what we think of today as Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, but it's clearly an earlier version of those holidays, not quite fully formed. Pesach seems to have a set date. Also note Pesach, not really a harvest thing at all. And no mention of weeks. You know, we call it Shavuot. Like, it has nothing to do with weeks or counting or anything like that. It's not tethered to Pesach at all, the way we think of Shavuot now. Okay, let's look at another source from Torah and see how the idea of Shavuot, as we know it, kind of evolves through later texts or later sources within the Torah. Could I get another different volunteer to read the middle source there from Numbers 28?
On the day of the first fruits, your feast of weeks, when you bring an offering of new grain to the Lord, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations.
Good. All right. Thank you, Lauren. So here we have the day of the first fruits, and there you have your connection back to that idea of Feast of the Harvest. It has to do with Bikurim. But here it calls it something else. It calls it Feast of Weeks. And you can see I highlighted B'Shavuotechem. Here it says your weeks. But here we have Shavuot for the first time. And what's brought? Mincha Chadashah. It's literally new grains. So here we have kind of an evolution of the idea of this Feast of the Harvest holiday. It has to do with offering the new grains, and it has something to do with weeks. It doesn't tell us anything here about how many weeks or what that means at all. We have to go to yet one more source from Leviticus. Laura, do you want to take this one too? You got off the hook easy there with just one sentence. Would you read Leviticus as well?
And from the day on which you bring the sheaf of elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. You must count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. All
right, thank you. So this may be familiar Hebrew to those who have been counting the Omer. Usfartem lechem b'mocharat Shabbat miyom haviachem et Omer hatkufa shava Shabbatot tmimot tiena. I can rattle that off because I've said it 49 times now over the last 7 weeks. So the day on which you bring the Omer, the sheaf of elevation offering, don't worry about what that is for the time being. The day after the Sabbath, don't worry about exactly that either. I'll give you some more info about what that might be in a moment. Count off 7 weeks. They must be complete, and you have to count until the day after the 7 weeks, 50 days, and then you bring your Mincha Chadashah. So now here, finally, we sort of can connect all the pieces together. It's actually pretty remarkable that the holiday as we know it today is never actually fully described in any of these sources. It's kind of pieced together through these kind of differing understandings of what exactly this is. In one place, it's a feast of the harvest. In another, introduces the concept of new grain. And in a third place, introduces the concept of counting off weeks. So today we understand that to be the 7 weeks following the beginning of Pesach, 49 days up to, well, tonight, right? Side note, because we are rabbinic Jews. We are not what they call Karaite Jews, although there are still Karaite Jews remaining. There's a stream of Judaism that's been around for many, many centuries in very low numbers, and it's really been sort of outside the mainstream of what we think of as mainstream Judaism, rabbinic Judaism. These are the Karaite Jews. The Karaite Jews reject the oral Torah, so they don't follow anything that the rabbis say in the Talmud. Their idea is to follow as closely as they can the text of the Bible itself, and they actually have Shavuot on a different day because of this line here where it says the day after the Sabbath, the day after the Shabbat, right? Now the rabbis, and we'll talk about how they get there in a moment, take that to mean the first day of Pesach, even though, as you know, the first day of Pesach is not always Shabbat, like capital S Shabbat, right? It is a Sabbath in the sense that it is a day of rest from work. But the Karaites interpret this and say, okay, we start counting the Omer the day after the Sabbath that falls during Pesach, which could be anywhere during that week, right? So they end up with a Shavuot that's somewhere between 1 and 7 days after ours. Very interestingly. Okay. Questions about the biblical basis of Shavuot? How we get there, how these pieces fit together. What questions do you have?
So were you thinking of Pesach as a Shabbat Shabbaton, or what?
You mean from the rabbinic perspective?
Yes.
Evidently, yes. Evidently, yes. We'll see in a moment why they may have been motivated to do that, because I tend to agree. Well, at least that maybe I'm inferring from your tone of voice that is not obvious from this verse, right? That the Shabbat, the Sabbath here, should be Pesach. That's not the obvious read of this verse. Let's go on. We'll talk about Shavuot as how it comes to be associated with the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, and this will come into view a little bit better. Okay. Here we have another nice illustration from the National Library of Israel, from a prayer book from 1450, a very old prayer book. So it's kind of easy, it's cynical, I think, to say the rabbis made this part up. The idea that Shavuot is linked to Pesach, as we saw, that's not obvious from it. That verse doesn't say Pesach, it says Shabbat, right? It says the Sabbath. It's kind of easy to say the rabbis made this up. The Torah itself doesn't associate Shavuot with Pesach. It also doesn't associate it with Mount Sinai. But consider that the rabbis who lived immediately before the destruction of the temple and in the generations following the destruction of the temple were the de facto religious leaders who were in charge of shepherding Judaism from a temple-centered religion to a diasporic religion, one that could sustain itself and be coherent without the benefit of a central temple. So if Shavuot was only about the regel, right, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for this, how do you do that when the Romans have destroyed the temple and you can't get there, right? So I think it's easy to be cynical about this and be like, oh, the rabbis just made it up, but I think they had a very good reason for what they decided to do and how they decided to interpret here. How they decided to interpret here is explained in this passage from the Talmud. It's from the tractate Shabbat. And can I get a volunteer to read? Someone who hasn't read yet. Anybody?
Sure,
I can't.
Sure, I'll read.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Great.
The sages taught on the 6th day of the month of Sivan, the 10 commandments were given to the Jewish people. Rabbi Yosai said, on the 7th day of the month.
Okay, quick pause. This is how the Talmud tends to work. It'll give you sort of two different opinions, and then it'll go on to explain how can these guys have different opinions. We have sort of all the sages in the Beit Midrash say one thing, and here's Rabbi Yossi on the other hand who says another thing, and they differ by one day. I'll spoil it for you because I didn't record this. I didn't continue the text this far. They disagree about when the start of the month was, whether it was a Sunday or a Monday, or at least that's how the Talmud understands their distinction. So that's how they get the difference between 6 and 7. Okay, not a big deal. Thank you, Amy. Keep reading if you would. Oh, you went back on mute. You keep reading for us.
Do you want me to continue?
Yes, please.
Rava said, everyone agrees that the Jews came to the Sinai desert on the new moon, as it is written here, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt. The same day came they, what? The same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. Without elaborating what day it was, and it is written there, this month shall be to you the beginning of months. It shall be the 1st month of the year to you. Just as there, the term this is referring to the new moon, so too here the term is referring to the new moon.
Okay. So
Wow.
did that make any sense?
No.
Okay, that's all right. This is how the Talmud likes to work. You are getting a taste of a very classic Talmudic style of constructing an argument.
So it's making an analogy. The verse that describes Rosh Chodesh says this month, and that means the day of
Good.
the new month, and therefore there's a similar wording in the description of the giving the Ten Commandments, and therefore it means the same thing.
Correct, Lauren. Yes, exactly. So this is a little easier to see if we were reading in Hebrew. But so Rava says everyone agrees the Jews came to Sinai on desert on the new moon. And as you may know, the new moon is the first of a Hebrew month. Hebrew months always start on the new moon. So everyone agrees they came on the first of the month. And we know that because we have this verse. In the third month after the children of Israel gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day. And here it says, B'yom hazeh. Hazeh means this, or the same day. That's when they came to the wilderness of Sinai. But they don't say without elaborate what day. It doesn't say exactly what that is. And we have another verse. So the first verse is what they call, I'm going to put scare quotes around here. And the second verse is what they call there. It's written there in a different part of the Torah. This month, again, it uses hazeh. This month shall be to you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And that's talking about the month of Nisan, which is the month the Passover is in. So just as it says hazeh there and refers to the new moon, so here it must be referring to the new moon. So basically they take that to mean the Israelites showed up at Sinai on the, I'm sorry, I said Nisan, but it's the first of Sivan, just like we said up top. Everyone agrees they showed up at Sinai on the first of Sivan. And as we read above, either on the 6th or 7th day is when they got the 10 commandments. Okay. So how do we know that it was after showing up at Sinai, it was exactly, well, either 6 or 7 days later? Well, I guess 6 days later, no matter what, depends when you think Rosh Chodesh is. That's what the rest of it is. Amy, will you read the last paragraph there for us?
Sure. And similarly, everyone agrees that the Torah was given to the Jewish people on Shabbat, as it is written here in the Ten Commandments. Remember the Shabbat day to keep it holy. And it is written there. And Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you came out from Egypt. Just as there, the mitzvah of remembrance was commanded on the very day of the Exodus. So to here, the mitzvah of remembrance was commanded on the very day of Shabbat.
Okay, does this one make any more sense to you, Amy? A little bit? Okay, so it's similar idea. We have 2 commandments, each one where they're saying, remember this day. And since we have 2, they assume that, well, they must be saying, you wouldn't say remember this day if you weren't talking about the exact day that it was. So if one of them says, remember the Shabbat and keep it holy, and another one says, remember this day, that must mean when the 10 commandments were given and Moses said, remember Shabbat, it must have that day been Shabbat, right? So they take that to mean, and this, boom, here we go. Boom, Torah is given on 6th of Sivan. Wow, look at that. The 6th of Sivan is 7 weeks after the beginning of Pesach. So that's when Shavuot is. And there you go. Shavuot is now associated with the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So the association is never clear in Torah. The Torah is really ambiguous about exactly the order of events and when things happen around the revelation at Sinai. And we get there through rabbinic interpretation. Okay. Questions, criticisms. What do you think? Are you following? Leah?
So it seems like I'm trying to formulate this. My mind's a little fuzzy.
That's all right.
That instead of the 49 days, the 7 weeks being how long it took them to get to Sinai. And that's one of my questions also. It's been, did it actually take them 49 days to go from when they were liberated to Sinai? But it seems like they've done this backwards.
Yes.
It just happened to come out 49 days.
Yes. So that's what I'm saying. It's kind of easy to be cynical and say the rabbis really wanted to associate Shavuot with Sinai. And so they kind of worked it backwards to figure out how they can make that work. And there's a lot here that where they're making decisions about how to interpret that are not totally obvious. Both of the interpretations in this passage of Shabbat are not obvious. I mean, they're within the rules of the game, but I would say that's not the plain sense of any of those verses. They had to read this verse back in Leviticus, about the day after the Sabbath. They had to say that means Pesach. Shabbat means Pesach. So yeah, I would say they did kind of work it backwards a little bit, but it does work out. If your goal is to kind of harmonize all of this stuff, and also to give Shavuot a meaning and a connection apart from just bring your stuff to the temple, then this actually works out really nicely, and it sort of becomes a part of the Louvre reenactment of Exodus from Sinai and arrival. I'm sorry, Exodus from Egypt and arrival at Sinai that we kind of reenact through the calendar year. So
they also make it Shabbats because it's 7 times 7. So they make it all in sevens.
Correct, right. So they would have said the first Shavuot was also Shabbat. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of a very holy number of days is 7.
Right. Exactly. Very good. Okay. Any other questions or comments about how we get there? Great. Okay. So that's kind of the essential basis and covers the kind of dual nature of Shavuot as both having to do with Bikurim, having to do with those first fruits, and also having to do with giving of the Torah at Sinai. Let's talk about some of those other traditions that you may have heard of. Let's talk about eating cheese. Shavuot, the cheesecake holiday. I like this picture. This is like a national dairy brand in Israel, Tnuva. Gvinot Tnuva. They have pretty good cheeses in Israel, actually. So there are a lot of ideas about where the whole cheese thing came from. I've picked 3. I would say there's probably at least half a dozen ideas about where the dairy products on Shavuot comes from. I think it's wise when you encounter situations like this where there are a lot of different explanations for the origin of a ritual. What that probably means is nobody really knows. A parallel example would be if you've ever been to a Jewish wedding. Frequently you see the groom, or sometimes these days both bride and groom, stomp on a glass and shatter it. No one has any idea where that ritual came from, but it's now very, emblematic of what a Jewish wedding is. And so you get a ton of different explanations about where the glass smashing comes from. It's a remembrance of the destruction of the temple, or it's about, it's something permanent that can't be undone, just the way this marriage is going to be permanent and never undone. You can read that however you want, because the reality is nobody has any idea where that tradition came from. I would argue the cheese thing is a little bit like that. Nevertheless, these are 3 of my favorite explanations for where the whole dairy thing comes from. Okay, someone who wants to read a very short verse, read a Song of Songs, if you would, please.
I don't mind reading.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Sweetness drops from your lips, O bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and the scent of your robes is like the scent of Lebanon.
Okay, if you can tell me what Lebanon smells like.
Cedars?
I would, yeah, probably, yeah, okay, probably. All right, very nice. All right, yeah, I guess I would take that as a compliment if somebody told me I smelled, rustic and like cedars, I suppose. Okay, the Song of Songs, no matter how much the rabbis really want it to be about the love relationship between God and the people of Israel, I will argue to my deathbed it's actually just really, really sexy, erotic poetry. However, we're going to read it. We're going to cut the rabbis some slack here and go with their interpretation for a moment. So if it is about the love affair between God of Israel, then, it may well be, Song of Songs is can also be about the love that God and the people of Israel share, which is expressed through the gift of Torah. And so one of the explanations I've heard is that this verse here, where it talks about chalav, milk, it's associated with basically, sweetness drops from your lip, O bride, honey and milk are under your tongue. If the bride is Torah, then Torah has milk under its tongue, and therefore we eat dairy products on Shavuot. Okay, does that do anything for you?
But
Holly likes it.
why isn't honey part of it too then? Like eating honey on Shavuot.
I think the answer is because of all these other reasons. Okay, Holly, you're on to read the next one then.
Okay. Dairy foods occur.
Oh, actually, hang on. Before we get, I'll make you read that one too. But before we get there, that middle line where it says gematria.
Okay.
The gematria. So yeah, read that.
Okay.
Or see if you can make sense of it for us.
Well, gematria, numerical value of milk.
Yes, chalav. Chalav.
Chalav.
Yes.
2 equals.
So the letter bet there is 2.
30 equals.
Lamed,
Okay.
and the chet is
8.
Okay, and how much is that up to?
That's 40.
And how many days and nights was Moshe Rabbeinu up on Mount Sinai before we received the Torah?
40.
So we eat dairy on Shavuot. Does that do it for you? Not yet? Okay, Holly, read us that last one. Read us that last one.
Right.
This one I have to tell you is my favorite. So the Mishnah Brura is a commentary from the Chofetz Chaim. So he was a rabbi in Poland about the turn of the 20th century. And it's a commentary on the Halacha Code, the Shulchan Aruch. So of course this halachist takes a totally halachic interpretation of this, and it's great. Okay, go ahead and read it, Holly.
Okay. Dairy foods, a correct reason for this.
Yeah.
That when Bnei Israel stood at Har Sinai and accepted the Torah, and then went down from the mountain to their homes, they found nothing to eat immediately except for dairy foods, because for meat, they would need much preparation to slaughter with a checked knife like Hashem commanded. Therefore, they chose on account of the time to eat dairy foods, and we do this as a commemoration.
Okay, does that make any sense to you? So basically, but prior to Sinai, prior to the giving of the Torah, they didn't have to do kashrut in the way that we now know you have to do kashrut because of the Torah. And that includes, eating, preparing your meats. It's got to be a kosher animal and checked properly and slaughtered properly and all this kind of stuff. But they had just gotten the Torah and they were starving. They had to eat something. So what did they do? Well, they had a dairy meal. Right? They didn't have time to prepare their meat. And so because the Israelites must have all eaten dairy immediately after Sinai, we eat dairy on Shavuot. Okay. Are you buying it? What do you think? That's not bad. That one's not bad. That one's my favorite. Yeah. Very rather elegant, I would say. And of course, the halachas. That's what he comes up with, right? Richard says, I read yesterday some Jews do eat foods with milk and honey for Shavuot. I think that is totally justified based on it now. Richard, Richard was saying earlier he ate he had soy cheese for soy dairy.
Yeah, we had soy cheese as part of our meal, and given the tenuous nature of these explanations for eating dairy, I'm absolutely sure that soy cheese fits the bill just perfectly.
Yeah, I think so too. I think if they didn't have meat to eat, they definitely would have eaten Beyond Burgers or tofu or something like that too. That would have been totally fine. That's all parv.
Well, I have something weird that comes to my mind.
Go ahead.
This is a very rational explanation. It's kind of convenient, and it makes me think of keeping kosher. And one of the explanations that I had heard was because in those days, pigs weren't clean, and therefore you shouldn't eat them, something like that.
Sure.
And then the other explanation I've heard is, and we came across this recently in one of the texts because God told us to.
Sure.
And so this seems to fall more into coming up with an explanation after the fact in some way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. It's just what popped into my head.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I'm pretty skeptical every time when someone tries to give a rational explanation for things like kashrut. And, you know, it's plausible, you know, that there were issues with pigs and this was a health and safety thing, but I think it's far more likely, far more plausible that they just wanted to do something different than all their neighbors.
From
And
a
if everyone else
modern,
was eating pork or whatever, you know, that this was a distinctifying thing. And I think this is probably pretty similar, that this tradition got started somewhere along the way and no one really knows how or why. And now we get to sort of drash it. We sort of get to explain it backwards and come up with these fun explanations for where it comes from. Lauren,
not to sidetrack the conversation too much. I guess the most persuasive modern biblical studies explanation I've heard for that is that you have these rules that are laying out different distinctions. Animals should swim or they should walk on the ground, and if you have something that does both, like a shellfish, then that's just not done. That's not proper. You shouldn't eat it. Animals should either fly or they should walk, and you have something like a grasshopper or a locust that does both, that's bad.
Rabbis were pretty uncomfortable with things that kind of straddled boundaries, straddled distinctions like that, didn't easily classify. I think you're right. And it's sort of beside the point, though. I mean, from our perspective, who cares where the mitzvah came from? That's a big part of what, you know, and for a lot of Jews, what makes Jewish practice distinctive from
tradition.
And it's tradition at this point, right? So like, who cares a little bit? Anyway, I like Mishnah Berurah's explanation. I think that there are more. If you do some Googling around, I'm sure you can find some other creative explanations for the dairy on Shavuot. But let's continue for the sake of time and talk about very briefly the tradition of Tikkun Leil Shavuot. This one, actually, there's a whole source sheet on Svaria that someone else has put together that goes into a bunch of different sources on how Tikkun Leil got started. Looks at some records of the earliest Tikkunei Leil that we have on record. It's fascinating, but that is a whole other shiur. So the short version of where did the tradition of staying up all night come from? For one thing, this practice is actually relatively recent. The earliest recorded examples of people undertaking this practice that we have come from about the 1500s. Yes, that's a long time ago, but compared to the length of Jewish history, not that long ago. But the connection is sort of similarly, it's possible the tradition got started for other reasons, and we're just now sort of linking it back to the Torah account. But the connection is to the Israelites' preparation for receiving Torah. So here in Exodus 19, so Exodus 20 is when we get to the Ten Commandments. This is the chapter just before that. There's the sign that says, "Let them be ready for the third day, for on the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai." So in interpreting this verse, we have a few different ideas. Here's the comment from Ibn Ezra, who is I want to say 9th century, could have been 8th or 9th century commentator on the Torah. Can I get a volunteer to read Ibn Ezra's comments? Maybe someone who hasn't read yet. Allison, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps a person shouldn't sleep on those days at night, because they will hear the voice of God in the morning, like the way the high priest on Yom Kippur.
So I think what Ibn Ezra is doing here, and thank you for reading, is I think he's sort of suggesting perhaps the meaning of this idea, be ready for the third day. Perhaps the meaning of that is a person shouldn't sleep because they're going to hear the voice, like the way of the high priest on Yom Kippur, if that's a reference to what's actually a Mishnaic idea, that the the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and utter the ineffable, impronounceable name of God out loud, and it would be this huge, powerful event. And I don't think it's recorded that he stayed awake for 3 nights before that. I don't think any person who stayed awake 3 nights in a row would really be in condition to do much of anything. But here's one explanation where we sort of start to associate this idea of staying awake. So even before the 1500s, in about the 9th century or so, we sort of have this idea of there was maybe some sort of staying awake or vigil at night prior to the moment of revelation at Sinai. Here's another explanation, and this is from the Magen Avraham. Yeah. Oh, right. I was going to say I know I had the comment on where exactly this one comes. So Magen Avraham is from the 17th century. It's a commentary, also like Mishnah Berurah. It's a commentary on the law code, the Shulchan Aruch. And here he kind of sums it all up. Could I get a volunteer to read the Magen Avraham's comments?
I'll go ahead and do that.
Thanks, Anne.
It says in the Zohar that the original pious ones would be awake all night working in Torah. And already most of those who learn do this. It's possible to give a reason for this according to its simple understanding, that Israel slept all the night and the Holy One, blessed be he, had to wake them, as a Midrash says. Therefore, we need to fix this.
Okay, so he's referring to about 3 different things here in rapid succession. That's why he sums it all up, but you kind of got to know what he's talking about. So the Zohar is the essential text of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And we have traditions from there that the original pious ones, they call them as the sages of old, would occasionally pull off these all-night Torah study sessions, right? That's already, he's sort of saying this is already common knowledge that this is the thing that people would do. And already, most of those who learn do that at some point, right? I would say similar today, most of us who go to college at some point pull an all-nighter, right? I know I did one. It's possible to give a reason for this according to a simple understanding. Then, yeah, the simple explanation of let them be ready for the 3rd day means they stayed up all night, right? And we actually have a midrash, which I couldn't find sufficiently in English and didn't have time to translate myself, but it says basically this, that even though the Israelites were supposed to have stayed up, because that was what God intended for them to do, they didn't, and they fell asleep, and God had to wake them up. And so now the reason for the Tikkun Leil that Magen Avraham is suggesting is to fix this. Basically, this is the way the Israelites screwed up way back then has created this kind of generational flaw that we are now obligated to correct. So actually, rather than commemorating what the Israelites did, this sort of still gets us to where we want to go. We're doing the opposite of what they did because they did the wrong thing. Now we're going to do the right thing, staying up all night, learning Torah. Just so you know, if you ever participate in a more full Tikkun Leil Shavuot, we talk about it as learning Torah, but the reality is any text is suitable. When we talk about Torah, there's sort of capital T Torah as in the 5 books of Moses, like the Torah. And there's also Torah maybe with a lowercase t, or in the more general sense, which is any kind of Jewish learning or Jewish knowledge. So what we are doing right now is definitely Torah, even though we're touching on texts that are, sort of all over the map. Some have designed kind of study programs, lists of, sequences of texts that you can learn on a schedule through the night. There are many Tikkun Leil programs, today that get run. There was a really amazing one that I miss dearly back in Boston, where basically all the rabbis and the scholars would converge on one synagogue in Brookline, and it was sort of a big Torah festival. There'd be a dozen different shiurim you could choose from, at all hours, and there would be sort of a cohort of people who would stay up all nights until the sunrise and daven shacharit together outdoors in the morning. Great experience, but like I said, it messes my internal clock up too much to really do. Okay, questions about Tikkun Leil Shavuot? Leah, do you have something to share? Yes.
Well, I keep thinking that being prepared and studying are kind of synonymous, and
Yeah, I like that.
Torah is written.
Mhm.
So in order to prepare for something written, you would study.
Yeah, I mean, there's the question of what would they have studied before the giving of Torah?
Right. But, well, okay. But then I
Don't
thought,
worry about it. The rabbis don't trouble themselves with that question. They talk about Shem and Ever. Like one of Noah's sons was Shem, and another one named Ever. They talk about how those guys had their own yeshiva back, in the, even just immediately after the generation of the flood. They had their own yeshiva where they studied Torah even before the Torah was given. The rabbis have no problem with sort of playing fast and loose with the.
okay.
Maybe they
So-
studied the Noahide laws.
Yeah, at times a circle. Yeah, sure. They could have studied. They were able to just divine Torah from pure reason. Like we could never reach their level. Don't worry about it. Leah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking of the other two festival holidays.
Mhm.
So on Pesach, we prepare by searching the house and getting all the chametz out.
Sure.
And Sukkot, we prepare by building the sukkahs.
Mm-hmm.
So it just was a nice parallel for me that each of the
Good.
holidays would have some kind of preparation for them.
Absolutely. I agree. I think this is one of my favorite, I mean, even more than the cheese, I would say. This is one of my favorite Shavuot traditions. Yeah, for that exact same reason. It kind of gets right at the core of what the holiday is about, and it does feel like preparation. Yeah, excellent. Richard, you're off mute. I imagine.
I've got a couple of I'll try and make very quick comments. One is from the Magen Avraham, where he said we need to fix this. I think really, I mean, that's a cute explanation, but also I think by making it that we have to do it here today, that we have to be like the Israelites, it makes it very present for us. And it makes it so that every Shavuot we receive Torah. And I attended a shiur this past week from the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, where they talked about that this is Zman Matan Toratenu, that this is the season when we receive the Torah, and it's not said in the past tense, it's in the present tense.
Yeah.
We are receiving it, and that we receive Torah daily. It was a great shiur. Anyway,
Nice.
so that makes it very, very present time. I'll also mention many years ago, and I'm talking like decades ago, I spent this summer in Israel, and for Shavuot, I had a friend who was in rabbinic school at the Reform,
HUC.
and so I went to a tikkun there, where the students from HUC and also from the conservative rabbinic students went, and it was a great tikkun, and it went all night. And then at around 4 in the morning, or maybe it was 3:30, everybody in that group, and of course from all over Jerusalem, walked to the kotel, to the Western Wall. And as the sun rose, and with all these doves flying in circles overhead, we had our service, and it was
wonderful.
It was incredible. It was an incredible experience.
Yep. The stay up all night and daven morning prayers as the sun comes up is definitely a unique experience, and you're gonna sleep all the next day. All right, let's we're great. We're very close to the end. We have 2 traditions left, one of which is decorating with greenery. I brought 2 sources on this one, and both are very short, and both essentially just say we decorate with greenery. In the Shulchan Aruch, so a law code from about 1563, we have the custom to spread out plants on Shavuot in the synagogue and in houses as a memory for the happiness of the receiving of Torah. Mishnah Berurah, here's Mishnah Berurah again. In remembrance of the joy of receiving the Torah, there were grasses around Mount Sinai, as it says, the flocks and cattle shall not graze. So basically, there's a midrash that suggests that somewhat miraculously there was like grazing grasses around Mount Sinai, and so now we decorate with greenery. This mostly just seems to be something done to decorate for the holiday because it's a happy holiday. There's really not a whole heck of a lot to say beyond that. There's no clever gematria or things like this. It's mostly just a long-standing custom of you got to decorate, and what's nice to decorate with in a sort of late spring, early summer holiday, it's nice green things. Oh, Lisa says, it strikes me that sleep deprivation is a method used across many traditions to lower the threshold to a mystical experience. Lisa, I hope you stick around and hold that idea for our second shiur today about maybe the threshold of a mystical experience. I think you're absolutely right. That could we. Richard, you're right. The Vilna Gaon forbid decorating with greenery because it was too much like, I don't know what Whitsun is. I heard it was too much like the Christians. Is that okay? Yeah, evidently at some point this was something of a controversial practice because there were other people around who decorated this way, and we wanted to, keep separate. I would say this is one of the less practiced ones that I've seen. But if you feel like decorating, it's, go nuts, right? Okay. Oh, I see Pentecost, and got it. Thanks. All right. Lastly, the last tradition of Shavuot we'll cover tonight. Reading from the book of Ruth. So there are 5 books that are called the Chamesh Megillot, the 5 scrolls. Many of which are, all of which have some tradition of being read on a holiday. There's only about 3 probably that you have ever read on holidays. One is an obvious one, Esther. The book of Esther we read on Purim. The book of Lamentations, Echa, we read on Tisha B'Av. And the other most common tradition is to read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. And again, there's no sort of obvious, reason in Torah or anything for doing that. But Ruth, in a lot of ways, if you're not already familiar with the story, is very on theme for the holiday of Shavuot. It combines the story of a woman who chooses to commit to life as a Jew, along the same lines as the acceptance of Torah is like commitment to living a Jewish life. That's a big part of what the story of Ruth is about, as we see here in the first chapter, the sort of famous line, Naomi, whose husband has died, says, "See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." This is widely interpreted to be a story of conversion to Judaism, although I think that's somewhat questionable. But it's certainly a story about a woman choosing to commit to be a Jew and to be with Jews. And so I'm very on theme there with the holiday of Shavuot. Additionally, it's also full of harvest themes. Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, need to figure out what to eat, and they end up attaching themselves to a man named Boaz, and they go about that by basically having Ruth go and follow along in the fields as the people are gleaning there. So it's a story that happens at harvest time too. So between these 2 themes, it's very thematically appropriate. And it's a wonderful story. If you're looking for a little more Shavuot study, I highly recommend reading the book of Ruth. And in conclusion, that's all the sources I have. I just have a few notes of conclusion to share before we take a quick break and come back. Going through these rituals, basically the Shavuot, eating cheese on Shavuot, Tikkun Leil, decorating with greenery, reading the book of Ruth. None of those are anywhere as recognizable or as resonant as some of those other Jewish practices, like lighting Hanukkah menorah or Passover Seder or things like this, right? So I think there's an interesting question to be asked, and I'm sure there has to be a scholar who's written this paper already, but why hasn't Shavuot undergone the same kind of development, the same kind of investment in it as some of these other quintessential Jewish celebrations? And there's there's not really one straightforward answer to that. I can tell you, growing up in the Reform community, you know, Shavuot didn't really mean much. It was the day we were what do you call it? Confirmation. Reform Jews have a practice, confirmation, sort of parallel to the Christian idea of confirmation for teenagers, and we would do that on Shavuot, basically to give it, to give it some more significance than it already had, which was very little. My sort of non-scholarly anecdotal suggestion would be, I think it probably has less to do with kind of inside factors about what Shavuot is associated with and how Jews understand it, and probably more to do with outside factors. If you think about why Hanukkah is such a big deal, I think it has a lot to do with Christmas. If you think about why Pesach is a big deal, I think it has a lot to do with Easter. There's not really another Christian or other, holiday near to Shavuot that kind of competes it and sort of drives the forces that make it kind of crystallized and defined the way those other ones are. And I think that's probably part of the reason why it's remained a little bit underdeveloped compared to some of those other holidays. And on one hand, I think that's kind of a shame, because these are really cool traditions, and this is a really cool holiday that doesn't sort of get enough exposure. But on the other hand, I think actually Shavuot, of all the Jewish holidays on the calendar, has some of the most opportunity for ritual development and religious and cultural investment and kind of revitalization. If you're ever, thinking of what would be a really cool ritual to add, you have an idea for something, you want to attach it to a holiday, I think this is sort of the most fertile ground, because there's so little that's really hard, fast and set about Shavuot. So I would encourage you to think about, what kind of traditions can you make for Shavuot, whether you're going from this list or not. What sort of rituals and practices make sense to you to do on a holiday that's both, that has harvest connotations and giving of Torah kind of connotations, and think about what kind of practice you might develop in your lives and might want to share with your community.